Most people picture Bonnie and Clyde as the fearless lovers roaring across America in stolen Fords, outsmarting lawmen, and living fast in the last echo of the Old West. But behind the photographs, behind the newspaper myths and the Hollywood polish, their real lives were far darker, messier, and far more complicated than anyone was allowed to see. These weren't legendary bank robbers with clean getaways. They were two damaged young people carrying secrets they never wanted the public to know. And once you see those hidden truths, the entire story of Bonnie and Clyde looks completely different. Number 1. The wife no one talked about. Long before she ever stepped into a stolen Ford with Clyde Barrow, Bonnie Parker was already somebody's wife, and that's something most people learning about her don't realize. At just 16, she married a man named Roy Thornton, a small-time criminal with a tendency to vanish for days, drink too much, and get into trouble wherever he went. The marriage fell apart almost immediately, but here's the part that usually gets left out. Bonnie never divorced him. She walked away from the relationship, but legally she stayed Mrs. Roy Thornton for the rest of her life. Even when she was deep in the Barrow gang's outlaw lifestyle, she still wore Roy's wedding ring. She also had a tattoo on her thigh 2 hearts with Bonnie and Roy. You won't see Hollywood mention that. When Bonnie and Clyde met in 1930, she was still tied to another man on paper. Yet when reporters or strangers assumed they were husband and wife, neither corrected it. The married outlaw couple idea helped build their public image. Newspapers were obsessed with the romantic angle, calling them the Romeo and Juliet of the highways, and that dramatic label sold papers. But the truth was far more complicated. People saw the photos of Bonnie smiling, leaning close to Clyde, holding pistols like props. They didn't know that she shared a bedroom with Clyde while still legally bound to someone else. The marriage to Roy is one of those historical details that didn't fit the glamorous narrative. A young woman living with an outlaw was already scandalous. A married woman living with an outlaw. That would have caused a moral uproar in the 1930s. Keeping Roy in the shadows helped protect the romantic myth, and Bonnie and Clyde absolutely leaned into that myth. They posed for playful snapshots. She wrote dramatic poems about their love, and magazines printed everything that made them sound like star-crossed lovers. But privately, Clyde had to watch her put on a ring with another man's initials each morning. It didn't mean Bonnie loved Clyde any less, but it does show how much of their legend is polished and simplified. She died wearing Roy's ring because the law never changed the paperwork. It's a strange piece of American outlaw history that rarely makes it to the spotlight, but it explains why their image always sat somewhere between truth and performance. Number 2. What prison really did to Clyde. The popular story paints Clyde as a natural-born outlaw, like he was destined to rob banks and run from the law. But the records, testimonies, and surviving accounts show something very different. Prison shaped him far more than crime ever did. In 1930, Clyde landed in the Texas state prison system, eventually assigned to the brutal Eastham Prison Farm. Eastham was known statewide as one of the harshest institutions Texas ever operated. Guards were violent, discipline was merciless, and inmates worked exhausting cotton fields under armed supervision from dawn to dusk. Clyde was small, young, and not physically strong, which made him a target. Inside Eastham, he suffered repeated abuse beatings, exploitation, and assaults at the hands of another inmate who saw him as someone who couldn't fight back. For Clyde, those months were a nightmare. There was no glamour, no high-speed chases, no dramatic shootouts, just humiliation that crushed whatever softness he had left. At some point, Clyde couldn't take it anymore. He snapped and retaliated. Using a piece of iron pipe, he attacked his abuser and killed him. Officially, another inmate who was already serving a life sentence claimed responsibility. Historians believe this was Clyde's first killing, a moment he never spoke about publicly, because it didn't match the rebellious outlaw image. It wasn't about money or adventure, it was survival and revenge. When Clyde finally walked out of Eastham on parole, he wasn't the same man. Friends noticed the change instantly. One said, "He went in a schoolboy and came out a rattlesnake." Clyde wasn't interested in becoming a millionaire bank robber. His true obsession was striking back at the Texas prison system that had traumatized him. He talked often about going back to Eastham one day to free other inmates and humiliate the guards. That dark motivation drove many of his decisions afterward, including the violent robberies that seemed reckless from the outside. So the Clyde Barrow the world knows, the fast-driving outlaw with a shotgun, was a rebuilt version of the man he was before Eastham. The real Clyde was shaped by fear, pain, and anger. He didn't run from the law because he loved the thrill. He ran because the idea of going back to prison terrified him more than death. That's a very different picture from the rebellious heartthrob shown in movies, but it's the reality Clyde carried inside him for the rest of his short life. Number 3. The self-inflicted wounds no one saw. When people imagine Clyde behind the wheel, they picture him as unstoppable quick, calm, sharp-minded, and always ready to hit the gas. But there's a hidden detail that shows just how desperate he became during his time in the Texas prison system. Clyde permanently injured himself just to escape forced labor. Prisoners at Eastham were pushed into grueling field work under the scorching Texas sun, often whipped or beaten if they slowed down. Clyde hated it so much and felt so trapped that he arranged for 2 of his toes on his left foot to be removed, either by another inmate using an axe or by Clyde himself in a crude, self-inflicted act. The injury did exactly what he hoped. It made him unfit for manual labor, which meant he no longer had to plow fields or drag heavy sacks of cotton across muddy rows. But the price was enormous. He was left with a permanent limp for the rest of his life, something the glamorized photographs and newspapers never mentioned. Reporters like to present Clyde as a fearless daredevil behind the wheel, but the truth is that driving for hours, climbing in and out of cars, scrambling during shootouts, every one of those actions caused him pain. The timing of the injury makes the story even more tragic. Only days after he lost his toes, Clyde's mother's petition for early release was approved. Had he known he was about to be freed, he might never have maimed himself. Instead, he limped out of prison, permanently damaged and emotionally hardened. Once he was back on the outside, Clyde did everything possible to hide the limp. Outlaw groups couldn't afford weakness, and he didn't want people to think he was slowed down. But those closest to him noticed the way he favored one leg, how he winced when running, how he struggled during fast getaways. Even with his disability, Clyde managed some impressive escapes, but historians say many of those moments came down to luck, powerful vehicles, and Clyde's determination, not physical strength. This secret injury shattered the idea of Clyde as an untouchable highway bandit. He was a young man who mutilated himself because he felt cornered. It's a reminder that behind the rebel image was someone already deeply scarred long before he fired a single shot at any lawman. Number 4. Bonnie's hidden injury and constant pain. Most of the world knows Bonnie Parker from glossy, staged photos leaning on a car fender, pointing a revolver, smoking a cigar, always steady on her feet. But by 1933, that version of Bonnie didn't exist anymore. A major car crash early in their crime spree left her with life-altering injuries that she kept hidden from the public. It happened during a late-night escape when Clyde missed a detour sign while speeding through rural Texas. Their Ford V8 launched off the road and crashed into a dry creek bed. In the impact, the battery flew forward, burst, and splashed boiling acid onto Bonnie's right leg, burning her deeply from hip to ankle. Some accounts say the burns reached nearly to the bone. Locals tried to treat her with home remedies baking soda, ointments, cloth wraps, but Clyde refused to take her to a real hospital because he knew police would arrive instantly. So Bonnie stayed in agony as the wound worsened. Infection set in, swelling grew, and every movement came with sharp pain. For months afterward, Bonnie could barely walk. Gang members often had to carry her, sometimes over fences, sometimes into cars, sometimes into the woods when they hid from approaching posses. This injury changed everything for the outlaw pair. They had to plan hideouts, escapes, and robberies around the fact that one of them couldn't run. They avoided rough terrain, chose routes with easy access to cars, and avoided any raid that required sprinting or climbing. None of that matched the tough, daring image reporters printed, so Clyde and Bonnie hid the truth as best they could. Clyde would help her pose in photos so she looked strong and balanced. Bonnie forced smiles even when she could barely stand. The painful reality was that Bonnie survived the last year of their outlaw life with chronic, debilitating burns. She spent nights in stolen cabins crying quietly while Clyde tried to find medicine. Simple tasks, getting out of a car, stepping onto the ground, kneeling, became nearly impossible. Still, she refused to leave Clyde or slow down the gang. She knew staying behind meant being arrested or separated from him forever. So the public image of Bonnie as a fearless outlaw woman, standing confidently with a rifle, hid a much darker truth. She was a severely injured young woman, pushing through unbearable pain every day. Her courage was real, but not in the glamorous way movies portray it, was the desperate courage of someone running on loyalty and survival, even when her own body fought against her. Number 5. They weren't really big-time bank robbers. People imagine Bonnie and Clyde as legendary bank bandits pulling off huge heists in gold-trimmed lobbies and escaping with bags of cash. But the records from the early 1930s show a much smaller, messier reality. Most of their robberies weren't big city banks. They were tiny gas stations, small-town groceries, tourist courts, and side-road cafes where the cashier might have had $20 in the register on a good day. In many cases, the gang walked away with barely enough money to fill the tank of their stolen Ford. Robberies that Hollywood would frame as dramatic, tactical assaults were, in truth, quick, sloppy grabs just to stay ahead of hunger and the law. Newspaper writers of that era exaggerated a lot because bank-robbing couple sold far more papers than tired fugitives living off pocket change. The myth also painted them as Depression-era Robin Hoods, stealing from wealthy institutions and helping everyday people. But researchers who dug through court records, police reports, and family testimonies couldn't find consistent evidence that they shared their earnings with the poor. Occasionally, they slipped money to relatives who sheltered them, but that wasn't generosity. It was survival. They weren't masterminds planning grand heists. They were broke kids doing what they could to stretch each day a little longer. Their real life was closer to an exhausting cycle of constant travel, constant fear, and constant improvisation than the slick crime spree posters later suggested. And that gap between the legend and the truth is one of the biggest secrets they left behind. Number 6. The bloody trail behind the glamour. While the public loved the idea of the rebellious outlaw couple, the actual trail Bonnie and Clyde left behind was soaked in violence. Modern retelling sometimes soften that part, leaning into the tragic romance angle. But historical records show that their actions directly caused multiple deaths, especially among law enforcement. One of the most notorious events happened in Joplin, Missouri, in 1933. Local officers approached what they believed was a house filled with bootleggers. They didn't realize it was the Barrow gang. The officers barely stepped inside when Clyde and his partner opened fire with automatic weapons. Detective Harry McGinnis was killed almost instantly, and patrolman J.W. Harriman died shortly afterward. Another officer was wounded. That shootout produced the famous photos the gang accidentally left behind. Bonnie posing with guns, Clyde grinning beside a Ford, and the gang's arsenal displayed like trophies. The public loved the pictures, but few linked them to the fresh graves newly dug for the officers killed. And Joplin wasn't the only tragedy. Across the Midwest and South, the gang wounded or killed additional officers during chaotic gunfights. Store owners and bystanders were caught in crossfire. Civilians and deputies were kidnapped during escapes freed later, yes, but only after being driven far from home at gunpoint. Some of those people described Bonnie and Clyde as polite or talkative during the ride, which fed into the "they weren't so bad" narrative. But the politeness didn't erase the fear or the trauma. Historian accounts remind us that behind every romanticized newspaper sketch was a grieving family. And for all the glamour in their staged photos, Bonnie and Clyde never wanted the world to focus on the funerals left behind. They preferred the spotlight of rebellion, not the reckoning of lives cut short. Number 7. How their choices destroyed their families. The cost of Bonnie and Clyde's actions didn't end with the gunfire. Long after the couple died in 1934, Their families remained trapped in the aftermath. Police and federal agents weren't satisfied with eliminating the fugitives. They wanted to dismantle the entire support system around them. In early 1935, authorities arrested roughly 20 relatives and friends for aiding and abetting the gang. Some had cooked meals for them. Others had given them a place to sleep because the Depression left families with little choice but to help their own blood. Courts didn't care. Bonnie's mother Emma and Clyde's mother Kumi were both sentenced to short jail terms, and several siblings, in-laws, and cousins received years-long sentences for harboring or helping the fugitives. Blanche Barrow, wife of Clyde's brother Buck, suffered one of the harshest outcomes. She was captured after the gang's brutal shootout in Platte City, Missouri. Glass shards and bullet fragments left her blind in one eye, and she was later sentenced to 10 years in prison simply for being associated with the gang. Buck, Clyde's brother, died from a gunshot wound to the head days after that same battle. Meanwhile, Bonnie's sister Billie Jean, along with other relatives, spent years battling the legal system and public scrutiny. Instead of seeing their lost children as victims of the era's desperation and poverty, many people blamed the families, accusing them of raising outlaws or hiding criminals. Old family photos from the funerals show entire groups dressed in black, not just mourning Bonnie and Clyde, but mourning the collapse of their own stability. The truth is that Bonnie and Clyde didn't purposely set out to destroy the people they loved, but their choices made that destruction unavoidable. It's one of the most painful chapters in the story, one rarely shown in movies because it breaks the romantic illusion. The legend ends with the couple dying together on a rural Louisiana road. Real life kept going, and the families paid the price long after the guns fell silent. Number 8. The cars and guns that became their coffin. Bonnie and Clyde had a very Old West mindset, defiant, restless, and drawn to the idea of living outside the rules. But unlike the cowboys and outlaws of the 1800s, their tools were modern. Clyde worshipped horsepower the way old gunslingers worshipped their horses. His favorite was the Ford V8, one of the fastest mass-produced cars of its time. He stole them constantly because they could outrun nearly every police car on the road. Clyde even wrote a famous letter to Henry Ford praising the vehicle as a perfect getaway machine, or at least that's how the story goes. Whether every detail is authentic or not, what is clear is his obsession with speed and technology. He also armed himself with the Browning automatic rifle, a military-grade weapon stolen from National Guard armories. The Barrow was powerful enough to shred car bodies, punch through brick, and leave law enforcement completely outgunned. For a while, it worked. Clyde's mix of speed and firepower made the gang nearly impossible to catch. They felt like modern shadows of old frontier bandits, except their horses were roaring engines, and their six-shooters had been replaced by automatic rifles. But their advantage pushed law enforcement to adapt fast. Officers across multiple states upgraded their cars, their weapons, and their tactics. Texas Ranger Frank Hamer, a legendary lawman, spent months studying the gang's habits before assembling a team of experienced officers armed with high-powered rifles. They knew the Ford V8's strengths, they knew the routes the gang favored, and they knew Bonnie and Clyde would never settle down long enough to play it safe. On May 23, 1934, near Gippsland, Louisiana, the officers set up an ambush along a quiet rural road. They waited hidden in the brush until Clyde's beloved stolen Ford rolled into view. Then they opened fire. The bullets tore through the car so fast and so violently that the vehicle essentially became a steel coffin. Bonnie and Clyde had no chance to react, let alone fire back. The legend often imagines their ending as a dramatic last stand, but the reality was a calculated takedown shaped by everything the couple themselves had chosen: fast cars, heavy firepower, and the illusion of invincibility. After the ambush, the bullet-riddled Ford became a grim traveling exhibit, shown at fairs and carnivals for years. The same machines that once gave Bonnie and Clyde their confidence ultimately showed the world exactly how their story ended. And that final twist their own tools turned against them is one of the darkest truths hidden beneath the legend.